Captain Midnight.
I like Dungeons & Dragons Honor Among Thieves. I know that's not the hottest take in the world. I think it's a fairly well-liked movie. I enjoyed it in theaters, and I've come to appreciate it even more in the years since. Sometimes I'll just throw it on in the background. And every time I do, I find myself Googling how that sequel is coming along, and I'm met with the same result. Not much progress, and if they do make a sequel, it will be for a significantly reduced cost. Looking into this over and over again, and then seeing how successful D&D has been in other mediums, really got me wondering, why can't Dungeons & Dragons seem to win over moviegoers even when the movie is pretty good? I actually have a lot of thoughts on this, and I want to get into it. Before I do, thank you all for watching, and if you want to subscribe to help the channel get to 750k subscribers before the end of the year, I'd really appreciate it.
Your dungeon master has placed you in a dreadfully precarious position. You're playing the most phenomenal game ever created. Your skin grows cold from your first glimpse of the enormous beast.
Okay, Dungeons & Dragons. I read a fantastic book recently called Game Wizards by John Peterson, which is about how D&D really broke into the mainstream slowly but surely, and all the internal conflicts at the original company, TSR, that came out of that. I think between reading about how haphazardly the game was sometimes managed back then, and how often fans are just viscerally angry at Wizards of the Coast, D&D's current owners, it's safe to say that the game has not always had the most consistent management at the helm. And yet, despite all of that, Dungeons & Dragons managed to become a juggernaut beyond the world of tabletop games. There's been a lot of best-selling novels through the years, especially in the 80s and 90s, some of them just massive hits, and in video games, it's impossible to tell the story of RPGs without D&D. Not just in its broad and obvious influence on the genre from the start, but even as a brand. From the gold box games of ancient PC gaming, which really set the bar of quality high from the start, to BioWare's Baldur's Gate games, to recently with Larian's Baldur's Gate 3, setting a new narrative standard for video game RPGs. Clearly, D&D is malleable enough to really thrive in other mediums. But both the first D&D movie from 2000 and Honor Among Thieves have disappointed at the box office despite being wildly different, and Thieves being a lot better than the first one. Why is that? Well, there's a few obvious reasons why D&D is harder to translate to a film. For video games, the interactivity from the tabletop experience can be maintained in at least some form, which is just not the case in movies. But when it comes to Honor Among Thieves, I have a theory here that you may or may not agree with. And I will admit right now, this is mostly based on my gut reaction to seeing the trailer for the first time back in 2022. Like I said, I ended up liking the movie, but I do think this was a really weak trailer, and my main thought was, why can't we have a Dungeons & Dragons movie that takes its fantasy setting seriously? Now, I want to separate that from my feelings on the actual film, because we're talking about a response to the marketing, not the film itself. I think the trailer sold us the MCU formula in a D&D setting at a time where people were starting to get pretty tired of that. It was deliberately comedic, self-aware, and quip-heavy. Now, the movie leaned into that absurdity more than I thought it would, and it made for a great experience where all of that was executed pretty well. And I totally understand why they went for that angle. That was definitely the style that was popular when the movie entered production. Also, the jokey tone actually matches how a lot of groups really play and experience the game. But still, I can't help but wonder, what if D&D had gotten the Lord of the Rings treatment instead? Now, I recognize on one level, this is kind of impossible. The Lord of the Rings are films based on some classic novels and were made by Peter Jackson and company during a specific and long gone era of movie history. But what I really mean, more than anything, is the tone. That earnest fantasy storytelling that's so hard to find in blockbuster movies. And I don't just mean right now, but kind of long before that too. While Lord of the Rings was a defining 2000 series, I think when you look at its influence on other films, it mostly comes down to children's fantasy stories, like Disney making some expensive Narnia movies, and historical epics like Troy and Kingdom of Heaven. In terms of fantasy movies in a similar vein, aimed at an older audience, pickings are surprisingly thin. I mean, what are we even talking about? Like Warcraft years later in the blockbuster realm? I love The Green Knight, but that's a dark Arthurian legend and a much smaller movie. Even when Game of Thrones was the biggest show on TV, taking its fantasy world very seriously, we didn't see that impact movies much. And this is the hole I was always hoping Dungeons & Dragons would fill. I don't want to hold that against Honor Among Thieves, which did what it set out to do much better than I expected. But if they ever take another crack at D&D and they don't want to do a sequel, I'd really like to see them try this. There's been great stories told in these worlds. Baldur's Gate 3 is a testament to that. But even the older Dragonlance or R.A. Salvatore novels, which are often written off as simple fantasy 101 stuff, I think are underrated and could form the basis of some pretty awesome movies. A Top Gun Maverick for the fantasy genre. A movie that goes out of its way to remind audiences why they loved all these things in the first place, to show what's still possible in high fantasy, and to not shy away or be embarrassed by it. And I want to be clear, this isn't because I dislike irony or self-awareness or anything like that. I love plenty of things that fit that description. But with this genre specifically, I feel like we're rarely presented with movies that are willing to take their world and characters as seriously as the old school fantasy lit that I grew up loving. And even the 2000 movie refused to go in that direction, being very light and campy. Avatar, for whatever else you can say about it, makes no apologies for taking its own sci-fi mysticism seriously and setting it in a world crafted by people with a very specific vision for what that should look and feel like. That is what I want. Kind of the opposite of those terrible looking Sci-Fi Channel movies. I probably should have watched those for this video, honestly. I had no idea they existed until just now.
Heal me. No.
D&D is a great springboard for creativity by the nature of its design. It allows for so many different worlds, so many forms of fantasy. So I'd love to see it put in the hands of a great director who wanted to take it in a more dramatic direction. Like a movie based on the Dark Elf trilogy, I think you would really have something there, but I'd be very open to a new story as well. I appreciate what Honor Among Thieves did, and I'd like another one. But I'd love to see a movie that really tries to breathe life into some of these older, less jokey stories in the same way that Peter Jackson did with Lord of the Rings. I know the confidence in some of these books might not be there. I'm not going to make the claim that these novels are at the level of all-time classics. I just feel like we threw out earnest high fantasy and even sword and sorcery movies at the exact time that audience interest in them was peaking, and I'm just not sure why. Maybe I'm too forgiving of tired cliches, you can tell me, but I like adventures. I like large-scale fantasy battles, looking on in awe at old ruins, and elves dealing with prejudice. I don't think all this stuff needed to be deconstructed when it hadn't really had its time in the sun on the big screen. And I don't mean the gritty action or palace intrigue of Game of Thrones, I mean the childlike wonder too. I think it's the balancing of those things that makes the Jackson movie so special, and feel so unique to this day. I believe there's an audience hunger for sincere fantasy that Hollywood itself doesn't seem to want to feed. There's a place for winking at the audience and acknowledging how goofy this all is. We did that, and I had a good time with it. But what I'd like to see above all is a well-executed D&D movie that's just completely unafraid to embrace this stuff. A movie that re-engages with those tropes and ideas in a way that tries its best to make these concepts feel exciting and alive again, not just point them out. That's not to say there shouldn't be any humor. Like Baldur's Gate 3 could be a very funny game at times. Same with the Lord of the Rings movies. But what's important is that they put out some capital F fantasy and ask audiences to totally buy into it. I want a D&D movie that's comfortable doing that, and most importantly, doing it well. Dungeons & Dragons: Honor Among Thieves deserved a little more recognition than it got, but I think that's because people are hungry for something else. Something that invites them into another world as much as the game was originally intended to. And I'm still hoping that movie is out there somewhere. I think every D&D fantasy world needs at least a little logic to actually feel real. Which reminds me, there's really no better time than now to beef up your logic skills. Yeah, how's that for transition, huh? Brilliant's new logic course is great, giving your mind a daily workout with interactive courses in math, programming, science, data, and more. And that's just the tip of the iceberg of what Brilliant has to offer. It's a learning app built around interactive, hands-on problem solving. You're not just passively watching lectures, you're being active and actually seeing concepts click. And it works. This active style of learning is shown to be 6 times more effective than just watching videos. Brilliant makes it easy to build a learning habit into your day. I've been using it for years, and they're always leveling up their game and making the experience even better. Over time, you'll see yourself going from the basics all the way to tackling some pretty challenging problems. Brilliant works on your computer or your phone. You can pick it up anywhere, at a coffee shop, on the bus, or at home before bed. Every course is built by experts from places like Stanford, MIT, Caltech, and Google, so you know you're getting high quality learning no matter what subject you choose. Stop memorizing and start mastering. Go to brilliant.org/midnight, scan the QR code on screen, or click the link in the description. Right now, Brilliant is also giving CAP viewers 20% off an annual premium subscription, which unlocks unlimited access to all their daily courses. That's brilliant.org/midnight.
Here's a special tip for the fellas and girls who have not already joined Captain Midnight's new 1940 Flight Patrol. You'd better hurry up and join at once, because there's a big adventure ahead. The thing to do now is to get started, because we're going to have not only barrels of fun, but loads of free gifts and prizes too.